Thank you, Jan, for your good presentation, and also to David. Thanks for a nice and sweet introduction. My presentation is no need to tell you, because that's where I'm going to focus on this evening. That is just recently happened last month in the capital, Tarawa. But before I move on to my presentation, I just want to leave you with show you something. Next or?
Whose days are numbered on the beloved atoll nation. Scientists have confirmed that together with low-lying atoll countries are standing in front line of danger from sea level rise. Our country will be underwater in 50 years' time, and so what will be our future? What will be the future of our children? Searching for myself, searching for my refuge, as the world is getting worse day and night. Why there is so much pain, why there is so much struggle, I cry to my Lord to help me through. Searching for myself, searching for my refuge, as the world is getting worse day and night. Oh yeah, why there is so much pain, why there is so much struggle, I cry to my Lord to help me through. My people, oh my children, my country, oh my own, stand firm and stay strong until the end of time. Climate change is going strong, the rising waves will hit us all, and I cry, oh yeah, I cry to my Lord to help me through. Tomorrow I'm not sure, as I try to see the future, as the world is getting worse day and night. My brothers and my sisters sitting on the other side with all their hopes, all their love for a strong future. Tomorrow I'm not sure, as I try to see the future, as the world is getting worse day and night. Oh yeah, my brothers and my sisters sitting on the other side with all their hopes, all their love for a strong future. My people, oh my children, my country, oh my own, stand firm and stay strong until the end of time. Climate change is going strong, the rising waves will hit us all, and I cry, oh yeah, I cry to my Lord to help me through.
That's an artist from Kiribati. He composed that song in 2013, and I think the message is very clear. The impact is there, and they are living, and they're also calling on their brothers and sisters on the other side of the planet. Now, these are the questions that I wish to to answer in this presentation. And 4 islands and countries that I was researching, but unfortunately I haven't finished analyzing my data on the other countries, but I finished so far on the Kiribati and Tuvalu, because I just came back from the island. I was exhausted and a lot of stuff there, so I will give you what I have so far, and I think it's like an overview of what I found, and also complement Jan's research. That's how I collected my data. I carry out a survey, and I also interview like editors and reporters, and also prime ministers and presidents, and policymakers, NGOs, and I also review existing literature on the media and climate change. The reason why I'm dividing my the number of people that I survey, like 150 each island, each country, like 50 from the community, those are not working, because I want to find out what they think about climate change, and also 50 from people in paid employment, and also 50 from high school. And from there, I try to understand how the people on the island from different groups, how they feel and receive, and how they interpret, and how they feel about climate change. It's quite an interesting result, what I found, especially from the capital islands, because the majority of the people they live in this like Phone Bay, that's the capital of FSM, and Tarawa, Kiribati, and Majuro, Maso Islands, and Funafuti, Tuvalu. That's what I found so far. The media is still operating within that new cycle. What, where, when, who, why, and how, they're still sticking to that. And with the climate change, they see climate change as a disaster, because in the beginning, climate change has been interpreted by the politicians as a disaster. So that's a kind of, they have that kind of interpretation with them. So when the media talk to them, they don't want to hear more about stories that they're going to sink, even though the truth is that the islands are in danger. But the problem is because climate change has been framed and has been interpreted the way that the politicians, instead of going down to the community and talking to them that this is going to happen, and now we're going to respond. But rather than that, they just say the islands will disappear in that 50 or 100 years. So imagine that when someone tells you to sink, how would you respond? I think that's the kind of feeling among many of the public, especially from the questions that I received so far. And then we have a blame game. There's some politics, blame game, debate, and skepticism, and science. When people, especially the journalists, they really want to read or write about science, because it's something to do with something they lack knowledge about, or something that they believe doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the scientists. And then we come up with something like, oh my gosh, nothing new in this story. So that's kind of feeling and attitude by the journalists in the islands. If it's not new, nothing new in the story, they believe that it becomes boring. If the stories keep on, and then they believe that it's boring. But the question is, who's bored, the journalists, the public, or the government? But I find no evidence to support the journalist claims that the public are bored or the story is boring. But I find evidence that there is a lack of knowledge on climate change, which I believe link to that kind of boring attitude. news must sell, and we all agree that the news must sell. But if the story won't sell, and then there's no point of putting the story in the paper because nobody is going to buy your paper. And if both sides are being published, and then there's a policy that the issue must close. And then when we come up with the issue of climate change, both sides are being published, so what is next? I think that's the kind of attitude and feeling among the journalists and the media in the Pacific, because when both sides have been published, then what is going to happen next? If no solution, then what are you going to do? But I think, as Jan said, mentioned earlier, they need to go beyond what they can see now. They need to go and see reports and find alternative, help government and policymakers with solutions. The problem what they didn't make connections or link the story is because, as I have found in my research, is that the journalists themselves don't think that's their job, to make connections. And I also believed when I was starting my career as a journalist, I also believe that it's not my job to find connections. When someone give me the story, I just write it down. Someone then give me the story and then publish without sitting down and thinking about how the story can be connected. Can I go on the internet to search if what happened in Kiribati, if it happens in Tuvalu or it happened in Majuro Islands, can I make connections? But we hardly find stories like this in Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the Majuro Islands. Now, yes, fishermen are struggling. In Tuvalu, I interviewed quite a number of fishermen, and they find it hard to get good cash to feed their family, and they're also aware that there's a change. But the third bullet point is that people are destroying their land, and they take sand and gravels from the beach, and because the media, it's like it's normal, and let them do it because it's their land. But somehow there's an implication on this on coastal land, and they also cause erosion. And what the Majuro Islands was doing is like, in response to this, it banned people from taking sand and gravels from the beach. And there's a company there that's bought guano from Nauru, and they bought the big, it's like the guano, and they bring them to Majuro Islands. They crush them and sell them as sand and stones for the people to use them, instead of taking sand from the island. The media also aware there's population growth, but when it comes to finding out why the capital is so crowded, because they live there too, and it's very hard for them to realize that this is the problem. But unless we provide them with something with the training, and then they will soon learn that something was not right, and there is a solution to that. These are the main sources in the islands. We have government, sometimes the internet, mostly the internet, and the foreign news media. When there's workshop, we go there and get stories. During high tides, we go there and get stories. When we see project, we see the roads construction, we see seawalls being built, we can get stories from there. And then you can see that's how limited our sources in the islands are. And this is also happening in the islands. It's like a game of yes or no, yes or no. When someone make a claim, and then we get a response, yes and no. So, and it's like a policy that's we can't put our views, we can't put our observation in the story, and we leave it to the readers to decide for themselves whether they are on the yes or on the no sides. And climate change, whether it's happening or not. But for how long can we remain neutral, and how long can we stick to that yes or no, especially with the issue of climate change, when the majority of the scientists have confirmed that there's something wrong, something changed, the climate change is real. And then I believe that the journalists need to readjust. They need to review their approach and their policy on this issue to do with ethics, as Jan said. Now we come to the training in the Pacific. I'm aware that a lot of trainings have been undertaken in the Pacific, but are dominated by NGOs and supported with foreign funds. Australia, the funds were SPREP, the SPREP was given funds, especially of BACMAS, and the BACMAS and these organizations would facilitate training for the journalists. Nothing wrong with the training, because the training aim was to help the journalists upskill and understand and learn more about their work. And the question of who is going to the training, the conference also matters here. Who get the invitation? The training seeks to increase climate change stories and also look at capacity building in order for the media to be knowledgeable and well-informed media, so it can help the public. These are the good times to have a training to the journalists, when governments and NGOs have a plan to execute, and the communication strategies is like they include the media in it. And the thing is, the training follows a top-down approach. It comes from above to the journalist. Also, the training is seen as a preparation towards something big. For example, when there was Copenhagen 15 in 2009, there was increasing training, a number of trainings in the Pacific, 2007, 2008, to help the media train them to report climate change and to increase climate change coverage in the Pacific. So when there's nothing big, no training. So I know that this would sound funny to you, but this is what I found, and this what I found from my research. The story on climate change is like, says climate change is real, but the public says, yes, we are aware of the changes. The story says, yes, you are sinking. Public says, no, we are not. Scientists prove that your country is sinking due to climate change and sea level rise. The public says, what about God's promise to Noah? So we can't see if there's no communication here. So when someone says this and the other one respond differently, so I believe that there's something wrong. When in fact they should be on one boat. They should be united. And the government says, we will relocate. This is on Kiribati only. But the public says, are you out of your mind? Where are you trying to take us to? Government says, wait, we are still lobbying. It says, New Zealand says, no climate change refugees allowed here. We will give you money and funds to adapt. This is the fact. Now Tuvalu, on the other hand, Tuvalu says, no, we won't leave our land. We will stay and fight. So when I hear this statement from the Prime Minister, I said, I think Tuvalu and Kiribati are on the same boats, that they are facing the same problem, but their approach is different. Tuvalu says, we will stay, because if we leave, climate change will follow us to any place we go. If we are in the United States, climate change still happen, and everyone loses. But if we stay and fight, that change. Maybe we can help change the world for the better. That's what the Prime Minister told me. And surprisingly, it's like the same feeling among the people on Fanafut, even though that they know there's something happening, but the issue of where are they going to? It's very hard to move people from their land, but it's very, very appropriate for them to find solutions within. Because if there's no solution and taking our people to nowhere, still waiting for another 50 or 100 years, the problem is still increasing and happening. I think this is what's happening in Kiribati. They have a different approach with the Tuvalu government. On the training alone, this is the rationale for training. They believe that short courses will help the journalists, because it's very hard. They don't have time to go to uni. I don't know who says they don't have time to go to uni. No wonder that's not. A number of journalists didn't have a chance to go to uni. One, the government is not in their plan to send journalists. And I know when I was in Kiribati, it's very hard to get a scholarship. I only get a scholarship after 4 years. And when I applied, they said, it's not in our, it's not in our plan to know, not our priority. And then the NGO stepped in and they said, if we can provide them with a short-term courses, it will help them. And with climate change, because no university in the Pacific is offering this course, maybe that's our chance to help them. But I agree that the training is important, but again, the training must come from here, and it must come from the journalists, and must be designed to meet the need of the journalists, because the journalists in the Pacific, and when we talk about Pacific Micronesia, like including Tuvalu, Polynesian, they are in the front line. And what the training so far is like putting everyone in one group, like the Melanesian and Polynesian and Micronesians. And at the end of the day, the Micronesians, they lose out for a few reasons. One, they don't have any network. They don't have any media association. In Kiribati, they don't have any. And the Micronesians, they didn't have any network like the media groups, like the Melanesia, they have their own, Samoa. And that is the problem, because what happened is like the Fiji, the Samoa, they are dominating the media scene in the Pacific. And when it comes to because climate change is the major problem, I feel and I believe that we should focus more, especially the NGO, they should pay more attention to the media in small island countries such as Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and the FSM. And that is their strategies. They send their people to the island to do a baseline study or a survey for 1 or 2 days to find out if they need this training. And then the report was written, the finding published, and the answer, yes, they really love this training. I haven't seen any training that's organized or taken place in the islands, like the outer islands in Funafut, in Tuvalu, or where the impacts of climate change are real. But what I have found is like the training mostly done in other countries, like Fiji or Samoa or Tonga, Solomon Islands, that's fine. But when we bring these people to train, they are not going to work for the Fijians. They work in their own country, and the impact is there. So I argue that if there's a training like this, they need to be separate. They need to be given a different training, and a training must take place in their own country, in their own language, instead of taking them to another country. And there's another reason, because of the infrastructure and communication are the problem in small island countries. I haven't found any study on this that's to find out whether the journalists have been invited to training. Well, are they still working or they changed career? I think this is another point that I also find out in my survey, because a number of journalists have changed career, and they said, has someone attended any climate or environmental workshop or training? Oh, yes, that guy, where is he? He worked with the president's office. I said, oh. So he's taking the knowledge with him, and the others are staying at no skill or knowledge on climate change. When I was there, from October to November, December, I spoken to the journalists and the media, and also to the government people, environmentalists, and they told me that's not enough coverage on climate change. And the journalists also aware that they are not doing, because what I mentioned earlier, it's like when both sides have been published, and then what is next? It's like the horizon is limited, because if there's nothing new, what's the point of doing another story? But as Jan mentioned in your presentation, this is to do with training. Or that's my suggestions for future inquiry. I believe that silent nations should agree on one position. They need to sing one song. Otherwise, if they are divided, and it would be hard to get a message that's the message out to the international community. And the median frontline countries, they should consider forming their network, because even if Kiribati and Marshall Islands and FSM and Nauru, they are part of Micronesia, they don't even have any Micronesian media network or something. This is to do with the colonial history, because the Marshall Islands was associated with the United States, as well as the FSM, while Kiribati is associated with the US, the British, and more link to Tuvalu, even though Tuvalu is a Polynesian, but they have they have relationship and cultural and geography and political. And the NGOs should pay more attention on connecting the sources and the media. I think the training is focused more on the journalists alone, but not on establishing connections between the media and the government. And also, I believe that the government is not aware that they believe that they have no responsibility to talk to the media, especially in the islands. They rather prefer to talk to someone who come from Australia and New Zealand. They will make them available to talk to these people. But when it comes to speaking to their own people, their own journalists, they said, tell them we are busy. They don't have even time. The only time they have, the free time is when they're going to sleep, I think. Another suggestion for future inquiries, like universities, to consider offering a new paper, because in the Pacific, no university in the Pacific has offered this program, and there are some courses like in the United States, Australia, they are offering a similar course around climate change and the media, but not in the Pacific. This is the capital, Tarawa, just recently, last month. This is the lagoon side. This is Nankai. It's a very tiny. You can see the lagoon and the ocean side. Water comes from this side. So on this side, there's a lagoon on this side. And that is the town, shopping center. This is hospital, Hospital Universo. You can see water inside, and the patient were moved to another place. That's Tuvalu. Majuro, Marshall Islands. And that's our newspaper. I was the editor. I'm the editor of that paper. And our policy is every issue should carry one climate change story, even when there is no source, government source. And I said, we don't care. If there is no government source, just talk to the people and get information from the internet, publish a story. That's our policy. We believe that people's views and hardships, is news. And the journalists can write their own observations about what is happening. They can go there and just write down and come back, write a story. Only on climate change. Other issues like political, they have to remain stick with their journalistic ethic. The principle of being in the middle, in the center, to remain neutral. But with climate change, because that's the main problem that's facing our country, I believe that we, the journalists, need to be part of helping our country find solution. And very easy for the journalists to go out and get story on climate change, to encourage them, rather than, no, it's boring, we just go and find a story on climate change, look at the seawall, how they're going to rebuild that, talk to the family about water, anything about food. No. And I believe if we can do this, the journalists will be in a better place to help their community. And on Facebook, we also join other groups, and we'll exchange stories with them, photos. We borrow their photos and stories for our readers outside and inside Kiribati. But that's all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tabarnang and Jan. And now they're going to share just a bit of a briefing before we start on this. Please, if you're going to ask a question or make any comment at all, just wait to get the mic so that we get it captured on our system here for the, for the live streaming and so on. But also, if you're reporting, quite a few here are actually reporting either Tawanui or reporting for other media. Can you please, everybody who does ask a question, make a comment, could you just please identify who you are and who you're with and so on. Okay, so over to our guests.
Over to the audience.
Kia ora, Kevin Hester. Has there been any investigation of the acidity levels of the aquifers in the wells in Kiribati or any of the other islands?
Yes, a number of our people have researched that, especially from SIPREP and from SPC. The trouble is we didn't get any connections with those who did the study. We try and if the only time that we get these ones, they are published on the website, then we are able. But if they are not, and then it's very hard to get access to this information. But yes.
And are you aware or not aware that that's become an issue already?
Yes.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Vernon Rive. I teach international environmental law at the law school at AUT. I'm just over the road. My major research area is climate change. I'm interested, thanks both for fantastic presentations. Jan, in particular, I wondered whether you had any comments about whether you think media coverage on climate change has matured over the last 20 years or so. Your PhD study was up until 2007 or so, and it's been 8 years since then. My own sense, having observed a lot of media coverage on climate change, is that there is a little more balance now in media coverage, both internationally and certainly in New Zealand. And I wondered whether you had any comments on that, and secondly, whether you've done any quantitative analysis of media coverage on climate change in New Zealand and can draw any comparisons between what you found in relation to New York Times up until 2007 and what's happening in New Zealand.
20 years is quite a long time, and you're right, there has been a change in the last few years, both in New Zealand and what I've seen in the news media in the UK and the US as well, but we'll just deal with New Zealand. There has been a change in the preparedness to accept that there is a problem. But the fundamental problem is still that the media are still focused on discussions about how to fix the problem. So they're looking at emission reductions very much still. There's a little bit more about the impacts on populations, not very much still. Not in New Zealand and not in the States and not in Australia. The connections, as Tabarnang was saying, between this is happening and this is connected with climate change and therefore this is what we recommend that communities do, that story is still not there. But there's an interesting split that I started to identify in my own research and that I can see happening as I read the news media a little bit and then as I talk to people. For quite a long time, the predominant framing of the story about climate change was it's a big political fight because the US can't agree with China, and by the way, the small island states are having a terrible problem, but they're fairly minor, and they have to, in the international field, also fall in line with New Zealand and Australia because we provide most of their aid. That's one of the fundamental facts anyway. what I'm seeing emerging, and this was starting to come out of my research. I wanted to investigate it further, but I hadn't asked the right questions in my research. The public were more prepared all the way through my research to accept that climate change and global warming were a problem than the framings in the news media. And so while the New York Times, and this was at the height of the period of skepticism around, about 1995 to about 2003, it was very much not decided, not certain, big fight. Let's talk about what the politicians are talking about. But at the same time, I split my analysis into the different sections of the newspaper. And so I could see what was being selected in the news sections, the political sections, the lifestyle sections, the motoring sections, the business sections, etc. Health, by the way, not a thing. It wasn't covered. It's a huge health issue. Climate change impacts wasn't there. But in the lifestyle section and in the regional New York region section, there were stories coming in like, oh, so we're having a dinner party and what are we going to talk about? Oh, we'll talk about global warming because the weather changed last week, or things like that. And this was a constant thread all the way through that people actually were getting it without any information, without any help from the media, because they live there. So the gardeners were starting to say, my plants won't grow, or I can grow subtropicals now where I never could before. But the story still in the political and the news sections was, it's global, it's political, it's not really happening to us. So that's a change that I've seen. I haven't looked as explicitly and quantitatively at what's happening in New Zealand and Australia, but as a New Zealander, I have always avidly read and mentally compared what I'm reading in New Zealand and Australian newspapers. I read them fairly thoroughly all the way through, I always have, with what I was tracking from the US. And it's the same pattern that I'm actually seeing. You're absolutely right. There is more preparedness on the part of the media now to accept that climate change and global warming probably is a problem. I really admire what Tabaranang is doing, getting his journalists out there to report. And I don't see this as not being valid journalism, because if we in New Zealand have a big storm, the journalists are out there reporting on, this house got flooded or this roof got blown off or whatever. This is valid journalism to report on the impacts. If your publics are experiencing it, you're doing the job for your publics by telling them what other people in their community are seeing. So I think that's still missing from most of the US, Australian and New Zealand journalism. In the UK and in Europe, they're making the connections and have been for a while. But we've been very heavily influenced by this very powerful and extremely well-funded skeptical lobby. The news media still are not talking to the public about risks to the public. And it's not just risks to life and property and health, it's real risks to the economy. What got me when I saw the US Southwest drought, and I knew at the time when I was reading it, and I thought, I can make a fortune if I invest in futures commodities, and I invest in grain and start to predict that, in the future there won't be so much grain coming out of the US mid-continental regions. Of course I didn't do it because I didn't really know how to do it, and at that stage I was spending all my money on travelling and working. But in fact it's a real economic issue, and it should have been reported. New York Times, for example, sees itself as a leader not just of politics but of advice on economic issues. This is very much an economic issue. And it's an economic issue not just for big governments like, in New Zealand. Oh, speaking of the public, sorry, I'll stop soon. New Zealand's done it already. Like the Northern dairy industry has realised that the droughts are increasing. They've moved to Southland. Yeah. So you've got it happening even here. Not advised by the media, not advised by the government, but it's happening. A lot to be said for common sense.
Hi, my name's Hannah Spixma. I'm a master's candidate at the moment and former journalist. I've got a question for each of you. So, Jan, I'll start with you because kind of carrying on from what Vernon said, I'm interested in, you mentioned that stories about climate change need that local element to them. And one thing I've noticed, both as a student and as a journalist, is that when it comes to local stories, there's a tendency to only focus on things that are so specifically relevant to a community. So, for example, if there's something going on overseas, it has to have a New Zealander to make it relevant. So My question is, if this is the case, how do you bring in, as a New Zealander, I think it's important to be talking about climate change in the Pacific, because to me that's so relevant to New Zealand, but how do you bring in the Pacific when you're trying to have this Kiwi local angle?
Well, I'll answer briefly and then I'll pass to Tabaranang, who knows it much better. And I know it's a slightly cynical response, but where do New Zealanders go in the winter? They go to the Pacific Islands, so why not actually look at the prime tourist locations, perhaps, and pick up stories there? And it varies by the island, but I know that in Rarotonga, for example, you've got quite a lot of flat land and lagoons. Go to the tourists' favourite locations and then talk about climate change there, perhaps. I think you could interest gardeners, because people are interested in gardening and growing things, and farmers, so you can start to look at what are people doing in the atoll nations where you've got an atoll, you've got a fresh water lens, that's where your water supply comes from, it floats on top of the seawater underneath the island, and people put down wells and grow plants, and they get the fresh water which is floating actually on top, but through the sand, with a little bit of the atoll about 3 metres on top. So if you're dealing with issues that you can relate to a gardening problem in New Zealand, you're likely perhaps to have more interest in that too. You can connect it. So you want to look for familiarities in your New Zealand audience and try to link them. I think you can do it. This is speaking as a cynical Westerner, but Tabaranang, how do you get people in New Zealand interested in what's happening in Micronesia as a journalist?
Yeah, I think in New Zealand we have many Pacific people here. That you can even see west or south and central. There are a number of Pacific people there. But the problem is you don't really know what the Micronesians are. I think this is one of the problem. But the journalists themselves, if they really want to establish the connections with the Pacific people and the other people in Micronesia, I think it's really up to them. If because we have travel, like you said, travel magazines, it's up to them, especially the editor, if they can look at people sending money back, and especially in the area, because a lot of Pacific people are doing a lot of things like sending money back. Western Union, every Bay Day they stand in a queue, and when you ask them what are you doing, they send money back to the family. I think one connection you can find. Why are you sending money to there? Maybe to help with the family education, or because I think that's one issue or one way of making connections, because they are still up to these days they are still sending money to their family.
Thanks. That's some good things to think about.
Actually, it just occurred to me too. One of the major media in the Pacific is radio.
Radio.
So why not start looking at making radio stories that can then go to the Pacific? Let's have a transfer as well.
Yeah. This lady here is from Pacific Radio. Radio 2, 531 BI. She's on Radio Tuvalu program. That's another way of.
Is it okay if I ask another question? Cool. And Tabaranang, this one is more for you. I just wondered, you mentioned that NGOs should pay more attention to connecting the sources and the media. And I just wondered in general how influential NGOs are in shaping discourse in the Pacific in terms of climate change and media.
Yes, mostly the NGOs and the trainers they provide training, and they have access to funding, and they also have access to the government policy makers. And the media, they are nowhere. That's from experience. This is what I found, because only when there's a time to apply for training, the NGO through the office of the president, they send emails to those in the media. So I feel it's not fair, because the training should come from them, but no. What happened is they are discussing a training somewhere. When everything is done, you just send emails and invitation, and I think there's no connection there.
Also, another thing, one initiative that I was involved with that was really excellent, and it feeds, I think, into what we're talking about the need for greater training, but also the need for more of a flow of information between government officials and government experts and the media and the communities. It was a project that was set up by UNESCO in 6 Pacific Island countries, where we ran week-long workshops, bringing together government officials from the environment departments and journalists, local journalists. So it was local, which I agree, it has to be. If you have a regional conference, the editors go, usually, because there are per diems and there's hotel accommodation and there's airfares. And the journalists who are working on the ground, for a start, don't go. And then, as Tabaranang says, if you give people that education, then they get promoted, and so they don't do it. But if you do it in the country, number one, you're dealing with the people on the ground, but the main point of these workshops and the real long-term benefit was that it established trust. We chose one, or we let the country choose one environmental issue to focus on for that whole week. We brought in the local experts, we brought in the local journalists, and we got them to work together on constructing one story, or one for print, one for radio, one for TV. And it worked, and they talked to each other longer term. So it's that connection of don't just run a workshop for journalists, but bring in the community, bring in the government officials, get them to realise that they're not the enemy. Because you said that your government treats the media as the local media as the enemy. Yeah. You can get round it.
Well, I have a question too. So, if I, this one's particularly for Tabaranang, and it's one of the points you made earlier on about no journalism school or no university around the Pacific actually has any course dedicated to climate change and environmental journalism. And the University of the South Pacific, which you were at for a number of years ago, has one of the best marine and environmental schools, campuses based there. And it would seem to be a logical thing that the journalism school there, and I'm raising this question because I think there are a few people probably watching tonight from USP itself. But wouldn't that be an ideal place to actually have a climate change course? And it's also probably a lesson for us as well.
I think that's what they can start off from at the moment. They just started step by step. You know, maybe anything is better than nothing if they have one course of pessimist or something to do with the climate change and the media. It's better than nothing because what happened now, they don't have any long-term training that is ongoing. What they have now is like as I said, if there's nothing big, no training, no funding, no training. And so it's not fair for the journalists and especially climate change. And I agree that they have a marine school there. They can start off. They can start off with what they have on the ground, and especially they can offer courses in the Pacific because it's country like Kiribati, Tuvalu, Marshall Islands. They have a USB campus there, and I think that it shouldn't be a problem for that.
And actually, just while the microphone's moving, could I say another thing? And that is, it's boring, it's happened once. Now, I know that the news goes, oh, we've reported climate change once, so that's it. But actually, in fact, if you take a mosaic approach to the story, which journalists do with any big story, you break it into bits and you keep feeding bits of that story in. I mean, when there's an election, you start getting occasional stories and then more frequent stories. In any place, you can easily, it seems to me, map out, all right, so we can start talking to people that are involved with fishing and find out if things are changing there. Let's talk to people that are farming. Let's talk to people that are growing. Let's talk to people that are planning buildings. What about planning where we're going to put our power lines and our phone lines? There's a huge number of separate stories which you can then feed in over a period of weeks or months or even over a year. So you keep the story bubbling by giving them new aspects of the same story. I don't see that climate change is boring as an acceptable excuse. Yeah. Well, you obviously don't, because you send your journalists out to get a story every week.
That's what the feelings is, because when I asked them why didn't you do a story on, they said it's boring because we have done that, so we don't know what is next thing.
Use your imagination.
Anyone who thinks climate change is boring isn't paying attention.
Yeah, exactly.
It's actually the most interesting story that I've ever come across because I've focused on it since 1987. It just kept on growing legs all over the place. And every time I thought I'd found something really interesting, then I'd find something even more interesting. I'm not bored with it yet, and it's been quite a while. Yeah.
Hello for Jan. James, this was a great presentation from both of you. My name is Fala Haulangi. I'm Tuvaluan, living Aokilani, Aotearoa, for quite a while now, and Tab used to be with me at the radio, 531 PI and New FM. He was the presenter for the Kiribati community, and I'm currently still there. I know, boring. Get a life with the Tuvalu community. So I just want to touch on a few things, Jan, and climate change is quite, very dear to my heart as well. I know I get a bit emotional sometimes when I talk about it. Like what you say, global, but people don't really care. I mean, we're all Kiwis here, and I think it's very important. So what shall we do as Kiwis, for Tab and I now? We call ourselves Kiwis now because we live here permanently. So what can we do to make sure that Kiwis, we don't make it look like as if that's something that happens in the Pacific? It has nothing to do with us. So how can we make it personalize it so that as Kiwis who live here, we feel that we need to do something, Let's not think like it has nothing to do with us here. That happens in Tuvalu, that happens in Kiribati, so who cares? So how can we make it like real to us? Because we always claim that we have a very close working relationship with the Pacific Islands. So how can we make it real, and make sure that we actually play our part, If it comes to political communities, what can we do as communities to actually make it like it's an issue that's, on top of our priority list? And when we talk about immigration as well, it touched me when a Kiribati couple who really tried to get their immigration papers sorted, and yet the immigration turned them down over and over and over again. When we know climate change is a real issue back home, and yet our policy here in terms of immigration is a slap on, our people's faces when they're trying to do that. I know globally, internationally, there is no law. There is no immigration law in terms of environmental refugees. So those are the kind of things I believe that as communities here, can we start looking into those kind of things to make it, But then it's a shame because our Kiribati brothers and sisters applied, they were turned down, and then my own people applied later on, and they managed to get through. So I believe there's a bit of inconsistency here. Like, how come the couple were treated differently compared to the Tuvalu, I mean, I'm happy they are, to be honest, they are my relatives. They were granted PR. But what about, I still feel for my Kiribati, brothers and sisters who applied, but they were turned down. So what's the difference between, their application and that Tuvalu application that, families that were put through? So those are the kind of things that I believe as, as a Kiwi, that what can we do as communities to make sure that it's on top of our list day in and day out. And when we go out there, global, climate change is real for our community in the Pacific, because I believe we have a very influential role to play here. But coming back to our communities back in Tuvalu, I know politics back home, and we also got to remember that we're sick and tired of being dictated to, because at the end of the day, our Pacific Island nations are given foreign aid all the time. So sometimes our leaders are told to shut up because we're giving you people money to help you, And so sometimes that's probably why the president of Kiribati is singing a different song, and the Tuvalu prime minister is singing different songs. Because I heard when I was at the seats in Samoa, there was a lot of talk about that. The leaders now are starting to sing different songs because we don't know what deals were made under the table that people are not aware of. All of a sudden, they are singing different songs. So what's going on? And when I was there, I saw China, complete control of Samoa. And so I tell you, I was really scared because everywhere I looked, everything was provided by China to make seats very successful. And that was my fear. I said, so what did the Prime Minister of Samoa sell to China to make them like they provided everything to make seats look really, really flash? And like, it was beyond me. I said, I kept on asking, how did you get this bus? How did you get this flash chairs in the side events that, you were expecting folding chairs, but so these are the kind of things that at the end of the day, money talks and control our people back home. But we need to do something. We need our help, to make sure that climate change is on the top of everybody's agendas, day in and day out. So that's my, as a Tuvalu, when I tell you this is on top of living wage. Beside living wage, climate change is a biggie to me as well. That's my contribution.
Bravo.
And actually, as you were talking, I was thinking of connections, because you started by saying there are so many Pacific people in New Zealand, and it's not just getting, as you said, connections with what's happening in the Pacific Island nations, but also there is this large population here. And I was thinking that, perhaps there is a lot of knowledge there that could be used. can you be doing what you can in New Zealand and then using that as a launching pad for then increasing knowledge in the Pacific? Now, for example, the New Zealand climate in Northland is changing to an extent where we'll be able to grow things, tropical fruit, like mangoes and bananas and things. There's a lot of knowledge in the Pacific community about these gorgeous, delicious tropical crops. Perhaps there can be connections made here with the orcharding industry, for example. I mean, perhaps if we can be thinking about what is actually going to happen quite soon in New Zealand, where's the knowledge? Well, the Pacific community's got this knowledge. Maybe you can make connections there. And if you are then working on, we are adding our knowledge to New Zealand because we have this particular knowledge of these utterly delicious things called mangoes and pineapples, and that having then said, well, we're living in New Zealand, we're contributing here, then perhaps you can use that as a springboard to greater awareness in the Pacific Island countries. I don't know what thinking you have, Taparanam.
Yes, especially with migration and also with the case of the Kiribati couple whose application was declined. Firstly, they were overstaying in New Zealand, and secondly, they were influenced by the government, President Dong's message of, we are sinking and we are disappearing, so we are going to migrate. But there's no plan. That's only what he said, but on the ground, he don't have any plan what they're going to do in what's here, that they're going to make connections or they're going to relocate their people. It's like only a political idea of the president, but they don't have any plan to support what the president said. So migration is what is being said around the world, but not on the ground, because people are not aware of what's going on, especially with the relocation. Yeah.
Because you know those photos that you showed of the water just completely covering the island, this needs, in my view, to get out. You said that in one of the king tides, all the children could do was swim because there was no land. Now, there are stories there that I think can be told and should be told.
Has covered a lot of that because it was even
Yeah.
there when kids are
Yeah.
in Tuvalu. So the water is like Majuro.
Yeah.
Coming from the
Yeah.
it's coming from the ground. So those are the things we know, but still no connection. We feel so disconnected, like that's there, who cares? Yeah. So it's that kind of attitude that
We ran that. That's right. We ran that batch of photographs from Majuro
Yeah.
last month. So it's good. And the interesting thing was that Radio New Zealand International then picked up within I think a couple of days. They ran a story as well. But I didn't see anything in any of the other mainstream media
No.
at all.
No, only Radio New Zealand International.
Radio New Zealand International did.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
of course, it's a very small audience, and it's actually
Yes,
a Pacific
exactly.
audience. Radio New Zealand National, I don't think actually had
No.
on their news, and none of the other mainstream media. So that's one of the problems we face.
Yeah, James is my name. I hear a bit on the internet and a little bit internationally about European agencies getting involved in the Pacific Islands. Like perhaps knowledge could be sourced from countries like the Netherlands, for instance, who didn't actually have a climate change problem, but they had huge storms back in the, because my mother's Dutch, had huge storms back in the 1940s, which just about put the Netherlands underwater. And they've got huge knowledge in water pumping and reticulation and, well, basically building land in the form of polders. So maybe, countries like that could be brought into the picture.
The Netherlands has been in the forefront of planning globally for sea level rise since right at the very beginning. It's interesting, they're the most populated country in the world, I think, and they're going to lose 2/3 of their land mass to sea level rise because they're so flat. And so, but they haven't only been focusing internally on what they can do. Right from the start, they did the first really important report on what can be done with sea level rise, and they didn't just do it from government scientists. They brought in their industrial experts, they brought in their hydraulics engineers and various other people from a whole lot of industries. They were mobilising looking outwards. They were looking at what can happen in the Pacific. So they actually deserve a tremendous amount of credit right now because they have led the way in a lot of the planning that has been done on what you can do as sea level rises. And they, for example, led the way in not just hard engineering, because cities can probably protect themselves, but it's the other parts that can't. But then they have looked very much at soft engineering options, like keep your mangroves, but then plant so that the areas, the waves come in, but the motion doesn't actually drag all the sand away. It's planted so it doesn't go. You're quite right that they have a lot of knowledge that possibly could be even more mobilised in the Pacific, but they've done a lot already. They've done a tremendous amount already. Just as the Scandinavian countries have done a tremendous amount on wind power, so that they lead the world now on wind power, and Germany has done a tremendous amount on fuel cells. And, that's interesting because those initiatives need to be driven by the governments. In the Netherlands, it was driven by the Netherlands government. Danish government drove the wind energy. I went to a conference in 1989 where the then German environment minister was saying, and we're telling our industries that they have to actually start developing things like fuel cells. And as a New Zealander and a reasonably cheeky journalist, I said, well, how can you? They won't want to do it. It will affect their bottom line. And he said, we'll tell them, and we have told them. And he did then, and now their businesses are reaping huge profits because they've got state-of-the-art fuel cells going on, which is what everybody wants now for motor vehicle transport apart from anything else. So it does pay for governments to lead the way, but in New Zealand they haven't, and in the Pacific they haven't for different reasons. So, there's a lack of political will. And if you explain to people that their house is going to flood, they're much more likely to be motivated by the way to also reduce emissions. I think you get more motivation if you focus on impacts as well.
There's been one specific role that the New Zealand government has got involved in a joint venture solar power project, which has been beneficial. I just can't remember all of it.
Up in Tuvalu, but now they are in Tuvalu as well.
Yeah.
They started last year.
Yeah, and that's a great example of what can be done that's been beneficial both to New Zealand and to the islands.
And the American protectorates are doing it too. I don't think they're protectorates anymore, are they? They're associates now, aren't they? Sure, that's happening in a small way. You do have to have the political will, but the political will comes from the public. And if we had a public in New Zealand, for example, that was aware that they themselves are being affected by the impacts, then that doesn't just keep the people safe, it also gives more motivation to the government to do more on the solution side, which is reducing emissions and finding ways of mopping them up and switching to renewable energy sources.
Kia ora everyone, my name is Alistair Carter from the Pacific Media Centre. My question is for Tabaranan. I'm very interested in this idea that in the Pacific, the land and sea is very closely linked, closely tied to religion, culture, tradition. It seems like the message isn't getting through. So from a journalist perspective, how do we go about breaking down those barriers and really getting the message through? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, the congregation, they listen more to the church ministers. So they respect their pastors, That's, I give an example. When I was in Tuvalu and I asked a question of Noah's Ark story, and the missionary there told me that there need to be a new interpretation of the Noah Ark story, and they believe that if we can reinterpret the story, that Noah's Ark story is not about the flood that we are seeing. What happened in the Bible is nothing to do with what happened now. Noah's story is like how the people sin to God, But here the people are destroying, the land. So God is giving them the knowledge to rebuild the land. So they believe that they need to retell the story and reveal it. But the people they listen to their pastors, to the priests, they respect them more. But if those in the church leaders, I say the church leaders, the pastor, if they can give a different story to the people, then I believe things will change. I give another example, like in Kiribati, during the church, the Protestant Church General Assembly, and the Secretary for Finance, he was seemed to believe in climate change. It's like an educated person. He stood up and said, we need to save some money to buy our land because we don't know that when the flood, when our island sink, we can get that. And the people there, they told him to sit down. They don't want to hear about climate change. Because as I said in my presentation, the climate change has been, in the beginning, it was interpreted wrongly. So it has been interpreted by the politicians as a sinking. Rather, it should have been like opportunity to accept something positive rather than negative. But my thoughts on changing the people's attitudes, it must come from the church, the leaders,
So
engaging the audience, yes. Yeah.
I think at class they need to get their messages right as well because it comes down to the messaging that it goes to the public, to the people, you know. And sometimes some people are sick and tired of being told, dictated to, all that crap once again, like, here we go again, reading, and then the messaging is not right. They're not stupid, our people are not dumb, Yeah, I'm sorry, but sometimes I get really frustrated on behalf of my people because that's what people are doing. And journalists come over from all over the country, same stories, same crap. Because I get it here all the time too. I don't know how they got my name, but everywhere from Japan, from Korea, from Australia, they ring me up and down, and all the time is that we want to talk to some Tuvaluans here. Why they came to New Zealand? Blah blah blah. Then week after next day, another one. You get really sick and tired of it as well. Like, I'm sorry, but we get overused.
Hi, I'm Cristina Berra from the School of Social Sciences and Public Policy. I'm a psychologist, though, by training, so I am very much aware of the issue of denial that you mentioned. So it's not, just a matter. So this is, like I said, just a comment, not really a question. Yeah, we can get the information out there. We can fill newspapers. How do we get people to read them? Okay, so I think that there is we need to work on all fronts, but one of them does need to be advertising. So not just information, but we need to start selling this idea. And when you try and sell ideas, you can do incredible things. I mean, I don't know if people have seen the movie that I think got some prize last year. That is about my home country, which is Chile. About the No campaign that was run, to vote Pinochet out, basically. So there was a referendum in Chile where people could vote either for or against Pinochet. That was purely advertising. Okay, that was one. So it wasn't a lack of information. People, had the information, but what the crucial element in that was actually advertising. So I think we need to. I don't know how. I mean, I'm not an advertiser myself, but I think there must be knowledge in psychology that we have used before to overcome fear of cancer. I mean, we have been, for many years trying to warn people about health risks. There must be stuff there that we can use. How do we tell people unwelcome news? How do we tell people things that they don't want to hear? Okay? I think that there's knowledge there that needs to be used. So that was basically it.
Could I just say that, it's the basic news, well, it seems to me, but it is. What's in it for me? And there's a lot of it in. For me, there's so many stories that could be told just in New Zealand on climate change. I am waiting for someone to do a story that says, John Key's favourite beach place at Omaha, sand dunes. And if you walk along the Omaha beach towards where the mouth of the river is, there are $1 million mansions all the way along. So the river comes down, and then there's this sand spit that goes out into the mouth of this river, concrete mansions all the way along. And if you talk to any river engineer, they will tell you that at some stage, especially with climate change, bigger storms, more rainfall, there's going to be one monumental flood that comes down and washes all those mansions away. And you've got the connection, you've got the political connection with John Key. That's one. But yeah. Unfortunately, no, I won't actually put a value judgment on this, but his house is at the other end of the beach. But you know, there are stories, lots of stories that you can tell, that you can connect to what people are interested in. Start talking to people that are dreaming of buying themselves a holiday badge. Don't go coastal unless you're planning to only live it out for about 10 years, and then you might be lucky. You know, there's all sorts of ways that you can actually link it into people's dreams and ideas now. You say advertising, and you're quite right. That's very important, but journalists can also get that message across by hooking into what their audience is interested in. Just as Tabaranang is doing in Kiribati, getting his journalists to go out and talk to the fishermen. Are your catches changing? Yeah. Things like that. Things that
Is that going to, convince New Zealanders in general that we need to reduce emissions with 50% by whatever the year is?
You know, I
Is
think
that gonna happen fast enough?
I think if you got New Zealanders hooked adequately into the idea that we are going to get more big floods, that there is going to be a lot more erosion, do look at where your telephone lines are. Consider whether your sewage is going to start to flow uphill if you live in a low-lying coastal region. You know, there are all sorts of ways that you can connect with day-to-day living with New Zealanders where climate change is going to affect people. So start talking to people about how it's going to affect their daily lives and make it local. You know, think about your local and regional newspapers. There are a lot of things that they can be talking about. Talk to the gardeners. If you're planning to put in cherry trees in Auckland, bad idea, they need frosts, they're not going to get them anymore. For example, you know, there are a lot of connections you can make, small connections there. I'm speaking as a journalist, not an advertiser, which I'm not. But I think there are a lot of connections that can be made that tell people what's in it for them, which is why they read a story in the first place. They don't read a story if there's nothing that's of interest to them. There's got to be a connection with their lives.
My name is Del from Pacific Media Center. My question is, I do agree with you that there are so many stories to tell, but the mainstream media is not interested. How do we penetrate them?
I still think that an argument about ethics might go a certain amount of the way. I do think that there has been a failure of journalistic ethics in this case. And you know, there's a sort of a bit of a shaking of the journalistic conscience that I've noticed in New Zealand just recently. Before the election, when you had, you know, Nikki Hager and the release of FBI files, and suddenly the media stopped loving John Key and started looking at the gloss and looking beneath the gloss. And so you can broaden that, and perhaps it can be, actually, you are endangering your populations and their economic interests. This is not according to ethics. Let us please have a look at ethics. It's actually hard. Media are used to being criticised unfairly, so they don't necessarily, the news media, the mainstream news media. I do think there are ways that you can do it, but also there's some exceptionally good stories there. I think if you could maybe we could start, well, someone, not me. There you go. Not me, not my problem. Can start selling the stories. I think there is a public interest that's greater than the media interest. I think, as Vernon says, that there's a change in the groundswell of what the media are actually, like they're starting to buy into the idea that it's a problem. So maybe these two are starting to come together anyway, that it's no coincidence that Northland dairy industry moved to Southland. People are showing it. The media actually do want to reflect what their publics are interested in. Maybe it's happening anyway. Slowly. Yeah.
Oh, on that note, we'll just finish up.
Well, actually, no. We've got. I believe we've got some. You know, we had lots of ideas and proposals right through the evening. But you've actually got a series of recommendations.
Oh yeah, we thought of some suggestions to be positive. And it's on a slide that David's got put up. Yes. Do we talk about them or just put them up on the slide? Oh yeah. I mean, that was the 2 paragraphs. We figured we needed 2 paragraphs to actually give a preamble before we put some recommendations up. With the idea that people actually are being endangered at the moment because they're not getting the information. But it actually is a New Zealand and an Australian problem and a Pacific problem. Just looking at the people, e tangata, you know, what's most important? It is actually really the people. And they're not being looked at the moment. And I do think there's a connection. If you get people focused on, oh gosh, there are some implications that are not so good for me, and there's also some very interesting strategies that I could bring in to make things better. It's not just a disaster story, as Tabalanang was saying. There's a huge amount of research now gone into not just hard engineering and technical options, but managing strategies, planning strategies, so that you don't have people feeling helpless. So perhaps if you could get the journalists to look at some of the documentation that is available there now, this is not reinventing the wheel, maybe you'll get a little bit more traction, which you want, Del. Does that click on? I think it does, because then, do you want to do the clicking? There you go. Oh yeah. So that's our suggestions. Well, a sort of a broad one first, but it's this training. Perhaps this partly answers your question too. If you can build, if it's possible to build training and more education into any of the journalistic enterprises. So in New Zealand, perhaps to persuade both the newspaper editors and the press council and the media councils for, whoever's responsible for television and radio, that actually training their journalists in something that has direct public health and safety impacts. Perhaps some training for their journalists. I think there's a need for journalists to have a bit more training in how to deal with scientific information. And my sense is, and this is from years in the industry, is that most journalists come from an arts background. They don't actually have a science background. And often they have a memory of either failing or not doing terribly well in the sciences. And you don't ever really want to write about stuff that you have a memory of failure in. But the scientific information that's there is not all that complicated. It is possible to actually trawl your way through the documents without, it's not nearly as bad as reading some academic articles. Actually, the scientific literature tends to be more coherent. I speak having just tried to find accessible articles for stage 1 students just only today, and some of them are dire. But in fact, the scientific reports on climate change are not nearly as dire as that. So yeah, I think training journalists how to establish whether scientists are credible or not. Tabalanang and I were talking about this earlier. We were talking about, it's not that journalists have to be neutral, because with climate change, in fact, the reality is that it's 99% of all the top accredited scientists know there's a big problem. How do you distinguish, and how do you work out whether a scientist is credible? You can easily actually train journalists on that. Why not get the programs going? And then, Tabalanang, do you want to move on to the Pacific training? You've pretty much covered that, haven't you? Yeah. Yeah, and then they sort of flip on, but this, you've got it here. Oh, you need to put the slides up for the live streaming, yeah.
Yeah, next. And when I say Micronesia, it should include Tuvalu. I mean,
Polynesian, okay? We are Micronesia. Don't get the wordings right.
No, I mean Micronesia. It should come the word like Atoll Islands,
Yeah.
Atoll Islands, low-lying islands, and like Tuvalu. But Tuvalu is, although it is Polynesian, but it's more closely, linked to those in Fiji, and in Kiribati, and in here, not to Polynesia. I think that's to do with airline.
Probably he was referring to Samoa and Tonga, because
Yeah,
dominating
yeah.
everywhere.
I think this is important. We both think this is important. You've got to bring the communities into it. It's not good enough to just train I think about training journalists, but in fact you need to be bringing both communities and governments into the idea that there's a whole lot of understandings and informations about what is going to happen, what to expect, and what to do about it. The information is there, but you need to be bringing it in across so that it's a collective enterprise, rather than just you get this situation in any country really where the governments see, the media are like this because they criticise the politicians, and communities are sceptical, and you can train across those. If you bring them in a collaborative training situation, you are improving trust overall. I think that's important. Yeah, that's Tabalanang's idea. A really, really important one, I think. Yeah.
I think it shouldn't be a problem because they have campus, in each country. They should, if that is a real problem for them, I think it's about time, or maybe it's overdue, but they should consider doing it. But
And what's wrong also with this huge Pacific population that we've got here and running related courses for climate change and the Pacific being run out of some of the New Zealand tertiary institutes, encouraging Pacific peoples to actually join those courses. They can then move it on from there as well.
And not just that, but if they can form like the organizations like non-NGOs, it's like a movement. Tuvalu has its own, climate change. But Kiribati, they don't have any climate change movement club or association.
Thank you all.